money and maybe do something about changing procurement patterns that we should learn from Europe.
When you mentioned the big civils projects, I mean, presumably those can only be done by the big companies. The question, the M25 couldn't be done by a lot of small companies, presumably.
Well, I think the highways agency could and should look at its procurement practice.
Okay. Sandra, do you want to?
Yeah, I just would like to say that I think it's just one of the natural effects of recession that you will get bigger companies bidding and underbidding in areas where SMEs were previously previously occupying and certainly diversifying into those areas. There is an initiative called the National Skills Academy for Construction, which is about employing local people on local projects. I think maybe we need to look at taking that a step further in terms of looking at employing local firms on local projects.
The question is how you do this, whether you do this by planning condition, which are notoriously, we have construction lawyer there, I don't know whether Tim you want to comment, but the history of trying to enforce it through planning route has been pretty tortuous, I think. Right, I'd like to move on if that's okay, thank you very much. I'd like to take two questions next. The first from Jane Baker, and there's two questions came in on roughly the same subject. I'd like to take one from Jane and then one from Barry. Jane, would you like to go first?
People are often encouraged to install energy-saving devices in their homes, such as solar panels, but these can be very expensive, and they do not address the issues of climate change or energy efficiency unless they're employed on a large scale. Do you feel this should be a public or a private sector initiative?
Right. Can we take that one, because there's another question, Barry. You had one which was a little bit on environmental issues as well. Can we take two questions and I'll throw that up to the panel?
First, I agree with the panel's opening remarks about in recession, sustainability is indeed an easy target. I also agree with the sound reasons why it shouldn't be. My question is, how do you think the financial implications of the recession are affecting the progress in addressing environmental issues associated with climate change?
Thank you very much. I think, Peter, because you touched on this a bit in an earlier comment about the matter of quality and so on, and perhaps you might like to pick up a bit of Jane's question too on how much, it's really a question of government intervention. Should the market and private citizens find their own level, or should we, as perhaps some countries have given us a lead, more government intervention? Could you start, and then we've got an environmental representative following.
I mean, I think it has to be a bit of stick and a bit of carrot. I think if it's just carrot, then people are naturally lazy, and they know, until oil prices go absolutely through the roof again, people won't have the incentive to do it. So I think that regulation does come in and has to play a part. I think in terms of who pays, I think is an interesting question. I think what interests me is not so much the sort of micro renewable side, because that can only take us so far anyway. I think what's more interesting is the whole issue of area-based renewable energy, combined heat and power, and the larger scale renewables that because we're building in more compact places and it's a higher density, that these more efficient ways of addressing carbon emissions come into play much more easily. And I think then that has a lot to do with the investment framework within which the large development is being brought forward. And I think that's where, for instance, in Northstowe, where if we are hoping that the Homes and Communities Agency will be in a much more leading role once their current negotiations with Gallagher's are concluded, and that we would really hope to see the government showing a lead in Northstowe in some innovation in area-based renewables, because that's the kind of place where it could actually work, and the government has to show, I think, put its money where its mouth is at that sort of scale. So I think that there are opportunities for government to do an awful lot more at the sort of neighbourhood level, particularly in the new communities that we're planning. I think at an individual level, I think a lot of it has to be just through tax breaks, maybe, as well as if there is, if fuel is going more expensive, that will also provide people with the incentive to make it worth their while to actually invest and install the micro renewables that we're talking about.
Would you argue there should be tax incentives? I mean, obviously, it's a zero-sum gain, so if you give tax breaks, you've got to tax somebody else more.
Yeah, I mean, we tax houses already through council tax, and so it seems to me that it shouldn't be too difficult to work in some formula that assesses the performance of a house that could be reflected in some discount.
Ted?
Without a doubt, the recession will affect the government's targets. They're struggling to achieve them at the moment, to be fair, and I think they will continue to do so. I think the government targets tend to be a bit woolly as well, because really and truly we haven't been able to measure CO2 emissions, and we've not done so. In terms of local renewables, I'd cite Holland as a classic example. They had tax incentives and grants for photovoltaics. They stopped those in 1999. Overnight, their PV industry died. So I think that tells you all that you need to know about that. And I think until there is a bit more carrot and a lot less stick, people will be less inclined to go down the local renewables route. What does continually frustrate me is the way in which schemes just seem to get by paying lip service, I suppose, to renewables. And that's where I think the stick should come in. And I think they really ought to start looking. I see all too many schemes that go through and you think they could do this, they could do that, they could do the other. And ultimately, somebody with some money turns around and says, no, it's too expensive, or we're not going to invest in that. And the key to it is actually joining capital cost and whole life cost. And the moment you start looking at the two in tandem together, then the whole debate is thrown open and you have a worthwhile debate. The moment you've got one man with capital cost and another with whole life cost, you're never ever going to have that debate, because the two have completely different agendas.
Okay. Worth pointing out, though, in terms of what Peter was saying about the government intervention, at the end of March of this year, the government did issue a construction supplement to the Green Book, which says how you may and may not spend public money, and that requires all people, all clients and those working for them, to get best value over the life of the building, and that the auditors, National Audit Office, said it will be enforcing that. So that will tie those two together. It's quite traditional in question time to have a vote in the audience from the statistically carefully selected balanced audience. Just interesting picking up those points. How many people here think there should be, specifically, there should be more government intervention of the sort Jane was talking about, implying in her question? How many people think there should be more government intervention? Would you like to raise a hand?